Her heart's takeover, the female CEO's arranged marriage changed into a passionate love story. Hello, my dear YouTube family. I hope that wherever you are happy and doing well. My heartfelt wish is that your faces always shine with smiles and that your lives are filled with endless joy. Reading your wonderful comments filled my heart with gratitude. It makes me so happy to know that I have such true and supportive fans. Your love and positivity are truly an honor for me. And here's something special. In my next story, I will include the names and comments of my top fans because you all are a part of my journey. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for your endless love. I am here only because of you, so keep showing your support and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin today's beautiful and heart-touching arranged marriage to love story. This isn't just a story, it's a journey of emotions that will surely touch your soul. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments about how you like today's story. So, let's begin. Ava Sterling had spent years building her empire, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and any semblance of a personal life to prove herself as the rightful head of Sterling Enterprises. She was sharp, strategic, and respected in the corporate world. Yet none of that mattered when her grandfather Theodore Sterling issued his ultimatum: marry within a month or lose control of the company she had poured her soul into. It was a crushing blow, not because Ava feared marriage itself, but because she knew exactly what it entailed in their world. The men from elite families would see her as nothing more than an acquisition, a trophy to be displayed rather than an equal partner. She had worked too hard to become a mere accessory to someone else's success. If she had to marry, she would do it on her terms. That was when she made a decision that left everyone stunned. She would marry not a businessman, not a socialite, but an ordinary employee from her company, someone who had no interest in power or wealth, and that someone was Lucas Hayes. She had noticed him before, not for the usual reasons, but because of his unwavering work ethic, his humility, and his quiet presence. Unlike the men who constantly tried to impress her with flashy cars and tailored suits, Lucas was different. He kept to himself, worked late nights without complaint, and never once looked at her with greed or ambition in his eyes. He was exactly the kind of man she needed, one who wouldn't try to control her or interfere with her business. Ava wasted no time. She had her assistant summon Lucas to her office, and when he arrived, she saw the confusion in his hazel eyes as he stood before her, clearly unsure why the CEO of the company had personally called for him. "Miss Sterling," he greeted, his voice polite but wary. Ava leaned back in her chair, meeting his gaze head on. "I need a husband." The words hung in the air between them, and Lucas blinked as if he had misheard. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "You heard me," Ava said calmly. "I need to get married within the next month or I lose my company. I've chosen you." Lucas's jaw tightened. Of all the scenarios he had imagined when he was called to the CEO's office, this was nowhere on the list. He was just an IT specialist, barely scraping by to pay for his mother's medical bills. The idea that someone like Ava Sterling, a woman who exuded power and confidence, would choose him for marriage was incomprehensible. "You don't even know me," he said cautiously. "I know enough," she countered. "You're hard-working. You keep to yourself. You don't seem like the kind of man who would use this marriage for personal gain." Lucas clenched his fists at his sides. He had never been the kind of man to take handouts, and this felt dangerously close to one. But then reality crashed down on him. His mother was sick, and the medical bills were drowning him. No matter how hard he worked, he was losing the battle. If this marriage could provide security for his mother, did he really have the luxury of saying no? He swallowed hard. "What exactly do you want from this arrangement?" Ava's expression remained unreadable. "It's simple. We get married, it remains strictly business, and in return, you'll be well compensated." Lucas hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. "And when the contract ends?" "We part ways," Ava said smoothly. "No complications." It should have been an easy decision. She was offering him financial security, a way to keep his mother alive. But there was something about this woman, something that made him wary. Still, he knew he had no choice. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll do it." Ava nodded, as if she had never expected a different answer. "The wedding is in 2 weeks." And just like that, Lucas found himself agreeing to an arranged marriage with the most powerful woman he had ever met. He told himself it was just a contract, that it wouldn't mean anything. But deep down, he had a sinking feeling that nothing about this marriage was going to be as simple as Ava claimed. The wedding day arrived faster than Lucas could have anticipated, and he found himself standing in a grand ballroom, wearing a tailored black tuxedo that felt foreign against his skin. The ceremony was an extravagant affair, not because of love, but because Theodore Sterling insisted on keeping up appearances. Lucas felt out of place among the guests, all of whom were from the upper echelons of society, their eyes filled with curiosity about the unknown groom. He ignored the whispers, his fingers clenching as he waited at the altar. Then the doors opened, and everything else faded. Ava walked in. For the first time since their deal, Lucas felt his breath hitch. She was breathtaking in a flowing ivory gown, her dark hair cascading in soft waves, her striking green eyes locked onto his. He had known she was beautiful, but seeing her like this, walking toward him with an unreadable expression, did something to him he wasn't prepared for. Their eyes met, and something flickered between them, something neither of them could name. This was supposed to be just business, just a contract. But as Ava reached his side, as he slid the ring onto her finger, and she did the same for him, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. This marriage was supposed to mean nothing, and yet as the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas couldn't ignore the way his heart pounded when Ava's hand brushed against his. He had agreed to this marriage to save his mother. He hadn't realized he might be risking something else entirely, his heart. Moving into the penthouse after the wedding felt surreal for Lucas. Just days ago, he had been living in a small, modest apartment, working late nights to make ends meet. Now, he was stepping into a world of wealth and luxury that felt almost foreign. The penthouse was a stunning masterpiece of modern design, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline, polished marble floors that gleamed under soft golden lights, and a sprawling open space that seemed almost too large for 2 people. It was the kind of home most people dreamed of, but for Lucas, it was nothing more than a reminder of how out of place he was in Ava's world. The silence between them was thick as they entered the space together. Ava, always poised and unreadable, walked in without hesitation, as if she had lived there her whole life. Lucas, on the other hand, felt like an intruder. His rough hands hesitated before touching anything, afraid that one wrong move would shatter something expensive. The weight of reality settled on him. He was now living with his boss, a woman he had admired from afar, but never truly known. They were strangers, bound by a contract, sharing a home yet separated by an invisible wall neither of them knew how to break. Ava barely acknowledged him as she walked toward the bedroom area, setting down her handbag with practiced ease. "Your room is down the hall," she said smoothly, her tone businesslike. "Everything you need has been arranged." Lucas nodded stiffly, gripping the handle of his duffel bag. He had brought so little with him, just a few changes of clothes, his laptop and the essentials. Compared to the grandness of this place, his belongings felt insignificant. He walked down the hall, finding his room exactly as she described, minimalistic yet luxurious, with a king-sized bed, a private bathroom, and a closet far too big for the few items he owned. He sighed, dropping his bag onto the bed before running a hand through his hair. This was his life now, at least for the foreseeable future. Married to a woman who barely looked at him, living in a home that didn't feel like his, and pretending that this was all normal. Days passed in an uncomfortable rhythm. They saw each other at breakfast but barely spoke. Ava would leave early for work, her schedule packed with meetings, while Lucas worked remotely on IT projects, unsure of what to do with his free time. He wasn't used to this level of luxury, this level of nothingness. He had always been busy, always struggling, always pushing forward. Now he had everything he needed, yet he felt lost. But what surprised him the most was Ava. She wasn't the cold, arrogant CEO he had imagined. She didn't treat him like he was beneath her. In fact, she treated him with the same level of respect she gave everyone, formal, polite, but not unkind. When they did talk, it was brief, practical, about groceries, house arrangements, work schedules. There was no warmth, no real connection, just two people coexisting under the same roof. One evening, as Lucas was working on his laptop in the living room, he heard Ava's voice on a call. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but her office door was slightly open, and her tone carried a sharp edge he had never heard before. "I don't care what they think," she snapped. "This is my company, and I will handle it my way." A pause, then a sigh. "No, grandfather. I'm not going to let you dictate my life any more than you already have." Lucas frowned, realizing she was arguing with Theodore Sterling. He had assumed Ava was a woman who had it all, power, wealth, control. But in that moment, he saw something else. She was fighting to keep what she had built. She was standing alone against expectations that tried to suffocate her. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of understanding. Later that night, as they sat at the dining table, Lucas did something unexpected. "Rough day?" he asked, breaking the silence. Ava looked up, momentarily surprised. She rarely shared personal matters, especially not with him, but something in his gaze was different. He wasn't prying, wasn't judging, he was just there. She sighed, setting down her fork. "It's always a rough day," she admitted. "Being a woman in this industry means fighting twice as hard for half the respect." Lucas nodded, understanding struggles in his own way. "You built something incredible," he said, his voice steady. "They can't take that from you." It was a simple statement, but it held weight. Ava studied him for a moment. Then, for the first time since their marriage, she offered him a small, genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was the first crack in the walls between them. As days turned into weeks, Lucas found himself watching Ava more closely. She wasn't just the powerful CEO he had admired from afar. She was a woman who carried the weight of expectations, who fought battles he had never imagined, who worked late into the night just to prove she belonged. And Ava, despite herself, started noticing Lucas too. He wasn't just the quiet IT employee anymore. He was a man who listened, who didn't judge, who saw her not as a CEO, not as a Sterling, but as Ava. And somehow, in the vast emptiness of their penthouse, in the cold arrangement of their marriage, something unspoken began to shift between them. Lucas had always assumed that people with immense power and wealth lived lives of excess, lavish parties, expensive tastes, and a sense of superiority that came with their status. He had seen it before in the upper management of Sterling Enterprises, men and women who flaunted their riches without a second thought. So, when he married Ava, he expected the same. After all, she was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, a woman who commanded boardrooms and dominated business meetings. But every day spent in their shared home made him question those assumptions. Ava was different. She didn't drape herself in diamonds or demand attention. Instead, she was quiet in her strength, humble in a way he never expected. It started with the weekends. Lucas had anticipated that Ava would spend her free time at extravagant social events, rubbing shoulders with elite investors and high-profile executives. Instead, he discovered her slipping out of the penthouse early in the morning, dressed in casual clothes, a simple ponytail replacing the sleek hairstyles she wore to work. Curiosity got the best of him one Saturday, and he followed her discreetly. What he found left him speechless. She wasn't at a high-class brunch or a luxury spa. She was at an orphanage on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by children who clung to her as if she were their world. He watched from a distance as she knelt beside a little girl, helping her with homework, her laughter soft and genuine. It was a side of Ava he had never seen before, one that had nothing to do with power or wealth, but everything to do with kindness. Lucas found himself watching her more closely after that. At home, she was different from the CEO he saw at the office. Gone were the designer suits and the authoritative tone. Instead, she wore comfortable loungewear, her feet bare against the marble floors. She made her own coffee, despite having a state-of-the-art espresso machine. She read books late into the night, curled up on the couch, her face softened by the glow of a dim lamp. She never demanded luxury, never sought validation through expensive things. In fact, he realized she had never once flaunted her wealth. The grand penthouse, the private driver, the expensive art on the walls. None of it seemed to matter to her. She lived simply, as if the power she held in the corporate world was something separate from the person she truly was. One evening, after a particularly long day, Lucas walked into the living room to find Ava fast asleep on the couch. A thick file of documents lay open beside her, her laptop still glowing faintly. She had fallen asleep in the middle of reviewing reports, her head resting against a pillow, her breathing soft and even. Lucas hesitated, unsure whether to wake her. He had seen her exhaustion before, the way she poured herself into her work, fighting to keep the empire she had built. But seeing her like this, vulnerable and unguarded, did something strange to him. Without thinking, he stepped closer. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. As he carried her to her bedroom, a strand of hair fell across her face. He shifted slightly, brushing it away with a tenderness that startled him. This woman, his wife, but a stranger just weeks ago, was nothing like he had imagined. She was strong, yet gentle, powerful, yet kind. And for the first time since their marriage, a thought settled into his mind, one that refused to leave. Was this really just a contract? Or was something deeper beginning to take root in his heart? The storm raged outside, turning the city skyline into a blur of water-streaked lights. The wind howled against the glass windows of the penthouse, rattling them with an eerie persistence. Thunder cracked through the sky like a whip, followed by a brilliant flash of lightning that briefly illuminated the darkened space. The sudden power outage had left the entire penthouse in shadows, plunging the modern, luxurious space into an unfamiliar kind of silence, one that felt heavier than usual. Lucas had been in the kitchen, searching for a bottle of water, when the lights flickered and died. He wasn't worried about the darkness. Years of struggling through life had taught him not to fear things he couldn't control. But when he turned toward the living room, he noticed something unexpected. Ava, curled up on the couch, her posture stiff, her fingers digging into the fabric of a throw pillow. She wasn't her usual composed self. The woman who commanded boardrooms with unwavering confidence, the CEO who never let emotions cloud her decisions, looked small in the dim light cast by the occasional flashes of lightning. Lucas watched her for a moment, debating whether or not to say something. Another deep roll of thunder shook the air, and she flinched ever so slightly. That was when he realized she was afraid. That realization unsettled him. He had never seen Ava show fear, not once since their marriage. She was always in control, always standing tall. But now, in the face of a raging storm, she looked vulnerable. It was such an unfamiliar sight that Lucas found himself moving before he could think twice about it. He walked toward the couch, his footsteps soft against the floor. Ava didn't look up, too focused on the storm outside. Without a word, he sat down beside her. Not too close, just enough so that she would feel his presence. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. The scent of her subtle vanilla perfume lingered in the space between them, mixing with the faint scent of rain drifting through the slightly open balcony door. "You okay?" he asked finally, his voice softer than usual. Ava exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady herself. "I'm fine," she said. But the tightness in her voice told a different story. Lucas glanced at her hands, still gripping the pillow tightly. Another sharp crack of thunder echoed through the room, and this time she squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment. It was instinctive, the way her body tensed, the way her fingers trembled just slightly. "You don't like storms," he stated rather than asked. Ava sighed, finally turning her head toward him. In the dim light, he could see the flicker of unease in her usually steady gaze. "I never have," she admitted. It wasn't a dramatic confession, just a simple truth. But something about hearing her admit that made Lucas's chest tighten. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside continued its chaotic symphony, but the space between them remained still. Then, suddenly, a flash of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the penthouse in a bright, almost unnatural glow. Without thinking, without hesitation, Ava reached out and grabbed his hand. Lucas froze. Her fingers curled around his tightly, as if seeking something solid, something safe. Her grip was firm, yet he could feel the subtle tremble in her touch. It was a reflex, something she had done without thinking. His heart pounded against his ribs. Caught off guard by the sudden contact, he wasn't sure if it was the shock of her touch or the fact that she hadn't immediately pulled away. He didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, he let his thumb brush over her knuckles gently, a slow, reassuring motion. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice steady. Ava didn't look at him, but she didn't let go either. For the first time since the storm began, she seemed to breathe a little easier. Her shoulders, which had been tense, slowly relaxed. The warmth of her hand seeped into his skin, and Lucas found himself unwilling to break the contact. It was such a simple thing, a hand in another's, but it felt like more. It felt like a shift, like something in their carefully drawn boundaries had blurred. Minutes passed, though neither of them kept track of time. The storm outside was relentless, but inside, within this darkened penthouse, there was a quietness that neither of them had expected. Lucas risked a glance at her, and in the dim light, he saw her looking back at him. Not as her husband by contract, not as her employee, but as something else entirely. Neither of them slept that night, but not because of the storm, because something between them had changed, and there was no going back. The grand ballroom of the luxurious hotel shimmered with golden lights, casting an elegant glow over the sea of well-dressed elites mingling over expensive champagne and polished conversations. Ava moved through the crowd with effortless grace, her tailored black gown hugging her figure in all the right places. She exuded confidence, poised, untouchable, and every bit the powerful CEO she had worked so hard to become. Yet despite her composed exterior, Lucas could see the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled just a little too tightly around the stem of her champagne glass. He had learned to read her in the past few months, and something about tonight unsettled her. And then he saw why. Standing too close to her was a man Lucas immediately disliked. Dressed in an expensive suit, he had the kind of self-assured smirk that belonged to someone who thought the world revolved around him. His hand reached toward Ava, his fingers dangerously close to grazing hers. She didn't pull away immediately, but her lips pressed into a firm line, her body language screaming discomfort. Lucas didn't need to be told who this was. He had heard whispers of Ava's past, the ex-fiancée who had once broken her heart, who had chosen another woman when Ava had refused to be his submissive little trophy wife. And now, here he was, acting as if he still had a claim on her. "She looks stunning tonight, doesn't she?" the man mused, his voice smooth with arrogance. "Ava, you always did have an untouchable air, but we both know you deserve a real husband. Not whatever this arrangement is." His gaze flickered toward Lucas dismissively, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. Lucas didn't think. He acted. In one swift motion, he closed the distance between them, his hands slipping around Ava's waist possessively. He could feel the slight jolt in her body, the way her breath caught in surprise as he pulled her against him. His grip was firm, but not forceful, protective, claiming. "She's already taken," Lucas said, his voice dangerously low, each word laced with a territorial edge he hadn't even known he possessed. The air around them thickened instantly, tension crackling like a live wire. Ava's ex-fiancé blinked, clearly taken aback. He hadn't expected a challenge, especially not from a man he saw as beneath him. "Interesting," he mused, his lips curling into a smirk. "I didn't think Ava would settle for someone so ordinary." Lucas's jaw tightened. He didn't care about wealth or social status, but the sheer audacity of this man made his blood boil. "The only thing Ava has settled for tonight," Lucas said smoothly, his voice deceptively calm, "is the fact that she's wasted even a second of her time entertaining this conversation." Ava, to Lucas's surprise, didn't correct him. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let herself lean into him, her warmth pressing against his side. Whether it was a silent agreement or an unspoken need to push back against the man who had once hurt her, Lucas didn't know. But it didn't matter. The ex-fiancé let out a low chuckle, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Well, well, I suppose I should back off. But remember, Ava, if you ever want more than just a placeholder husband—" His words trailed off suggestively, his smirk deepening before he finally walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Lucas could feel Ava's breath against his neck, shallow and uneven. His hand was still on her waist, his thumb unconsciously tracing slow circles through the fabric of her gown. The realization of what he had just done, what he had felt, hit him like a freight train. Jealousy. He had been jealous. Fiercely, irrationally jealous. And the worst part? He didn't regret it. The rest of the event passed in a blur. Ava remained close to him, whether by choice or necessity he wasn't sure. But Lucas was hyper-aware of her, the scent of her perfume, the occasional brush of her fingers against his, the warmth of her presence beside him. And yet neither of them spoke of what had happened, not until they were alone. The car ride home was thick with silence, heavier than the storm that had raged days ago. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind a tangled mess of emotions he didn't know how to process. Ava sat beside him, her posture unnaturally stiff, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why did you do that?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if she was afraid of the answer. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenching. He could lie. He could brush it off, say it was just instinct, that he was only protecting her reputation. But none of that would be true, because the truth was far more dangerous, because you're mine now, because the thought of any other man touching you makes me want to break something, because I want you in ways I have no right to. But he couldn't say any of that. Not yet. So instead, he exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Because he disrespected you," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, "and I don't like it when people do that." Ava didn't respond immediately, but when he risked a glance at her, he found her watching him, her expression unreadable. For the rest of the ride, neither of them spoke another word. But the air between them told a different story, one filled with unspoken truths, unsaid desires, and a fire that was only just beginning to burn. The evening was quiet, the soft hum of the city blending with the gentle sizzling of vegetables in the pan as Ava stood by the stove, carefully stirring the sauce she'd been preparing. Cooking had always been a therapeutic escape for her, a rare moment of normalcy in a life filled with relentless board meetings, financial reports, and the constant pressure of running an empire. But tonight felt different. There was an unfamiliar flutter in her chest, a restlessness she couldn't quite shake. She had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings, negotiating contracts and making high-stakes decisions that left her exhausted. And yet, despite the weight of her responsibilities, there was a strange sense of anticipation lingering in the air, something she couldn't define. She told herself it was just another evening, just another night in their strange arranged marriage. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Just as she reached for the seasoning, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. She turned instinctively, only to find herself staring at Lucas as he walked into the kitchen, shirtless. Her heart did something odd, a quick, unexpected stutter as she took in the sight before her. His toned chest glistening slightly from his post-workout sweat, the way his muscles flexed as he ran a hand through his damp hair. He was casual, effortless, completely unaware of the way her pulse suddenly raced. He smirked, catching her staring. "Like what you see?" he teased, his voice low and playful, his green eyes twinkling with mischief. Ava immediately snapped out of it, rolling her eyes as she turned back to the stove. "You wish," she muttered, but the warmth creeping up her neck betrayed her. Lucas chuckled, leaning against the kitchen island. "You're a terrible liar, Ava." She huffed, trying to focus on her cooking, but her hands were suddenly unsteady. Why was she flustered? He was her husband, at least on paper. She had never been the type to swoon over a man, and yet here she was, feeling like a foolish schoolgirl, just because he had walked in half-dressed. In her haste to regain control of the situation, she moved too quickly, reaching for the sauce without looking. The next thing she knew, warm liquid spilled down the front of her dress, staining the fabric a deep red. "Damn it," she hissed, stepping back. Before she could grab a napkin, Lucas was already in front of her, his movements swift and effortless. He took a clean cloth from the counter, his fingers brushing against her waist as he gently dabbed at the stain. His touch was light, careful, and yet it sent an electric current through her entire body. Ava froze. The space between them had disappeared, and suddenly she was acutely aware of how close they were. His scent, warm, masculine, laced with the faintest hint of sweat, wrapped around her, intoxicating and distracting. She looked up, intending to thank him, but the words never came. Their eyes locked, time slowed, the air between them thickening with something unspoken, something undeniable. Lucas's hand lingered a second too long, his fingers barely grazing her skin. His gaze darkened, his playful smirk fading into something deeper, more intense. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Then, without warning, he leaned in. His lips met hers in a slow, deliberate kiss, one that stole the breath from her lungs. Ava stiffened at first, her mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. But then she melted. It was different from anything she had ever experienced before. It wasn't rushed or hesitant, nor was it fueled by duty or obligation. It was real. It was raw. It was the kind of kiss that stripped away all pretenses, leaving only the undeniable truth between them. Lucas's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, and she didn't resist. Instead, she reached up, her fingers tangling in his hair as she deepened the kiss, letting herself get lost in the moment. She had told herself this marriage was nothing more than a deal, that Lucas was just a name on a contract, a temporary presence in her life. But now, with his lips on hers, with the way he held her like she was the only thing that mattered, she realized how wrong she had been. The heat between them grew, the kiss turning more urgent, more desperate, as if they had both been waiting for this moment longer than they cared to admit. Lucas groaned softly against her mouth, his grip tightening, his hands sliding up her back, pressing her flush against him, and God, she wanted more. But then, as if reality had finally caught up to them, Lucas suddenly pulled back, his breathing ragged. Ava blinked, her own breath uneven, her lips still tingling from the intensity of what had just happened. For a long moment they just stared at each other. Neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something heavy, something unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. Lucas exhaled sharply, his hands still resting on her waist. "Ava," he started, but he didn't seem to know how to finish the sentence. Ava swallowed hard, her mind racing. She should say something, set boundaries, remind them both that this was just an arrangement. But she couldn't, because for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to. Instead, she whispered the only truth she could admit to herself in that moment. This wasn't supposed to happen. Lucas's jaw clenched, his hands flexing against her waist before he slowly, reluctantly let go. "I know," he murmured. But the way he looked at her said otherwise, because deep down, they both knew the truth. It had already happened. And there was no turning back. Ava had always prided herself on being in control of her emotions. As the CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies, she had spent years mastering the art of maintaining a composed, professional demeanor, never allowing emotions to cloud her judgment. Love, relationships, and attachments had no place in her carefully structured life. But now, sitting across from Lucas at the dining table, pretending everything was normal, she realized that she had lost control of the one thing she had always guarded, her heart. It had started slowly, almost unnoticeably, like a whisper in the back of her mind. The way he pulled out her chair before she sat, the way he made her coffee exactly how she liked it without ever being asked, the way his gaze softened when he looked at her as if she were the most important thing in his world. Those little moments had begun to chip away at the walls she had built around herself, and now, no matter how much she tried to deny it, there was no escaping the truth. She was falling in love with Lucas Hayes, her husband in name only, the man who was never meant to be anything more than a contract-bound partner. The realization sent a wave of panic through her, but she forced herself to remain calm, focusing on the food on her plate rather than the man sitting across from her. But even that was impossible. Every movement he made, every glance he stole at her, every quiet breath he took felt magnified in the suffocating silence between them. She wondered if he felt it too. This unbearable tension that had settled between them, thick and heavy like an unspoken confession, lingering just at the tip of their tongues. Did he notice the way her breath hitched whenever he came too close? Did he see the way her fingers trembled slightly whenever he brushed against her, or was it all in her head? The worst part was not knowing. The worst part was the uncertainty, the doubt that gnawed at her every time she let herself believe, just for a second, that maybe, just maybe, he felt the same way. But then reality would come crashing back down, reminding her of the brutal truth. Lucas had never chosen her out of love. He had agreed to this marriage for his own reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with feelings. He needed financial security for his mother's medical bills, and she needed a husband to satisfy her grandfather's conditions. That was the arrangement. Nothing more. And yet, her heart refused to accept it. She could still feel the ghost of his kiss on her lips, the way he had held her as if letting go wasn't an option, the way his fingers had traced her skin with a tenderness. That couldn't possibly be fake, but what if it was? What if she was reading too much into it? What if he was simply playing his role, doing what was expected of him? The thought made her stomach twist painfully. Across from her, Lucas was battling his own turmoil. He had never intended for this to happen. He had never thought, even for a second, that he would fall for Ava Sterling, the untouchable, brilliant, breathtaking woman who had once been nothing more than his employer. When he had agreed to this marriage, he had convinced himself that he could remain unaffected, that he could be her husband on paper without ever letting himself feel anything real. But that illusion had shattered the moment he kissed her. Because the second his lips met hers, everything changed. He had tried to tell himself that it was just a moment of weakness, a slip, a mistake. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wanted her. Not because of their arrangement, not because of obligation, but because she had become the most important thing in his life. Every day, she unraveled him a little more. Every smile, every laugh, every vulnerable moment she let him see only made him fall harder. But what terrified him the most was that he had no idea where he stood in her heart. Did she see him as just a temporary fixture in her life, someone who would disappear when the contract ended? Did she regret the kiss as much as he cherished it? Did she feel anything at all? He had caught the way her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. He had felt the hesitation in her touch, the way she leaned into him before pulling away, as if afraid of her own emotions. He had seen the conflict in her gaze, the same conflict that tormented him every night. But he couldn't bring himself to ask, because if he did, and her answer wasn't what he wanted to hear, he wasn't sure he could bear it. And so they continued this unbearable dance, both of them pretending, both of them afraid to take the first step. Ava convinced herself that falling for Lucas was a mistake she could still fix. Lucas convinced himself that loving Ava was a battle he had already lost. But love, no matter how fiercely denied, had a way of breaking through even the strongest barriers. And soon, neither of them would be able to pretend anymore. The night had been long, filled with laughter, celebration, and the intoxicating clink of champagne glasses. The event had been a success, but for Ava, it had been exhausting. The weight of being the CEO, the expectations placed upon her, and the facade she had to maintain had drained her. So, when the night ended and Lucas guided her back to their penthouse, She was already feeling the effects of the alcohol warming her veins. She wasn't drunk, not completely, but there was a looseness in her movements, a soft, unguarded look in her usually sharp eyes. Lucas had seen her in control, composed and powerful. But tonight, as he carried her into the bedroom, he saw something else, something softer, more vulnerable. He carefully laid her down on the bed, brushing a few strands of hair from her face as she murmured something incoherent. He chuckled softly. "You should rest," he whispered, standing up, ready to leave. But then, before he could take a step, her fingers curled around his wrist, stopping him in place. He looked down, his breath catching slightly as her eyes opened just enough to look at him. "Stay," she murmured, her voice soft, barely above a whisper, but it sent a jolt through his chest. Lucas stiffened. He shouldn't stay. He knew that. This marriage had started as a contract, a means to an end, but things had changed. Feelings had started creeping in, unexpected and dangerous. He had been fighting them, convincing himself that Ava was just his wife on paper, that whatever was growing between them was nothing more than a temporary illusion. But the way she was looking at him now, her fingers still clinging to his wrist, her eyes heavy with emotion she wasn't saying aloud, it shattered all his defenses. Ava. He hesitated, giving her a chance to take it back, to release him. But she didn't. Instead, she pulled him closer, her fingers sliding up his arm, resting against his shoulder. "Just for tonight," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Lucas felt something snap inside him. He'd spent weeks keeping his distance, pretending he didn't notice the way she smiled at him, the way his heart raced whenever she was near. But now, none of that mattered. The restraint he had so carefully built crumbled. He cupped her face, his thumb tracing along her cheek as he slowly leaned in. The moment his lips touched hers, the world around them ceased to exist. It was slow at first, hesitant, as if both of them were testing the reality of what was happening. But then Ava sighed against his lips, her arms slipping around his neck, pulling him down fully onto the bed with her. That single action was enough to undo him. The kiss deepened, turning urgent, raw. Lucas's hands explored the delicate curves of her body, his touch both possessive and reverent. He had never wanted anything as much as he wanted her in this moment. Ava responded just as fiercely, her fingers tangling in his hair, her nails digging into his shoulders. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a surrender, a confession of everything they had been too afraid to say out loud. The air between them was thick with need, with emotions neither of them had acknowledged until now. Lucas pulled away for just a second, his breathing ragged. He rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice hoarse, giving her an out, one last chance to pull away. But Ava shook her head, her eyes dark with longing. "Don't stop," she whispered. And that was all the permission he needed. Clothes were forgotten, barriers stripped away as they lost themselves in each other. Every touch, every whispered name, every kiss pressed against heated skin spoke of something more than just physical desire. It was raw, desperate, like they had been waiting for this moment for far too long. Lucas memorized every inch of her, the way she arched beneath him, the way her breath hitched whenever he kissed the sensitive spots along her neck. And Ava, she traced the scars on his back, held him close as if afraid he would disappear. It was unlike anything either of them had ever felt before. The world outside ceased to exist. There were no contracts, no business deals, no expectations. Just them. The night stretched on, filled with whispered confessions neither of them fully realized they were making, and when the passion finally settled, when they lay tangled together beneath the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the curtains, silence settled over them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Lucas propped himself up on one elbow, brushing a damp strand of hair from Ava's forehead as he gazed down at her. She looked at peace, her lips swollen from his kisses, her body wrapped in the sheets, her fingers still lightly resting against his chest. He had never seen her like this, so unguarded, so completely his. A deep ache settled in his chest. He had been lying to himself all along. He wasn't just attracted to her. He wasn't just fulfilling the obligations of a contract. He was falling for her. As Ava's breathing slowed, her eyelids growing heavy with sleep, Lucas stayed awake, watching her, memorizing every detail. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. Would they go back to pretending? Would she wake up and regret everything? He didn't know. But what he did know was that tonight had changed everything. There was no turning back now. Lucas tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer as he pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. For the first time since their marriage began, he didn't feel like an outsider in her life. He didn't feel like just an employee who had been given a place in her world. Tonight, she had let him in, and he wasn't sure he could ever let her go. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. Ava stirred beneath the silk sheets, her body still warm from the night before. A slow, satisfied sigh escaped her lips as she turned, expecting to find the comforting weight of Lucas beside her. But the space was empty. The sheets were cool. Her heart clenched. Sitting up, she glanced around the room, hoping to hear the sound of the shower running or footsteps in the hallway, but there was nothing. Just silence. A deep, crushing silence. Her fingers curled around the sheets as reality set in. He had left, without a word, without a note, without a goodbye. A sharp pain pierced through her chest, far worse than she had expected. She wasn't naive. She knew their marriage had started as a business deal, a contract binding them together for convenience rather than love. But last night had been real. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered name, it hadn't felt like an arrangement. It had felt like something more. And yet, he was gone. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to push down the sudden sting of tears. What had she expected? That he would wake up beside her, press a soft kiss to her forehead, and whisper promises of forever? Number that wasn't who Lucas was. He had been clear from the start, this wasn't meant to be real. Dragging herself out of bed, Ava wrapped a silk robe around her body and made her way to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face in an attempt to shake off the dull ache in her chest. She refused to let this get to her. She had built an empire with her own two hands, had faced ruthless competitors, boardroom betrayals, and the weight of an industry that constantly tried to undermine her. She had survived all of it, and she would survive this too. It was just one night, one mistake. That was all. She straightened her shoulders and walked out, determined to put distance between herself and whatever last night had meant. Lucas, on the other hand, was far from composed. He sat in his office at the company, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup as he stared blankly at his computer screen. He had left before dawn, slipping out of the penthouse as quietly as he could, his heart pounding the entire time. He had told himself it was the right thing to do, that if he had stayed, he would have made things worse. Because the truth was, last night had shattered every boundary he had tried to keep in place. He hadn't just touched Ava, he had given himself to her, and he had felt something terrifying in return. Running a hand through his hair, he let out a frustrated sigh. He had been a fool to believe he could keep things professional. Ava wasn't just his boss, wasn't just the woman he had married out of necessity. She was everything he had never dared to want. But wanting her came with consequences. He was just an employee, a man who had been given a temporary place in her world. She deserved someone powerful, someone from her own elite circle, not a man who had grown up struggling to pay medical bills, not a man who had nothing to offer her beyond his heart, a heart that wasn't even supposed to belong to her in the first place. The hours dragged on, and Lucas felt himself growing restless. He checked his phone for the 100th time, but there was nothing. No text from Ava, no missed call. Had she even noticed he was gone? Was she relieved? His stomach twisted at the thought. By the time the workday ended, he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to see her, needed to know if he had ruined everything. When he arrived at the penthouse, his heart pounded against his ribs. He hesitated before stepping inside, half expecting Ava to greet him with a teasing smile, or at least a sarcastic remark about his early departure. But when he found her sitting in the living room, her eyes glued to a document, her expression unreadable, he knew something had changed. The warmth in her gaze was gone, the familiarity, the ease. It had been replaced by something distant, cold. "Ava," he said carefully, stepping closer. She didn't look up right away. She simply turned a page, her movements controlled, almost robotic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "You left," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. But the weight of those two words crushed him. Lucas opened his mouth to explain, but he didn't even know what to say. How could he tell her he had left because he was scared, that he had woken up with her in his arms and realized he never wanted to let her go, but that he didn't deserve to hold on to her? Instead, he ran a hand over his face and sighed. I needed to clear my head." Ava finally met his gaze, and the disappointment in her eyes nearly destroyed him. "I see," she said, nodding slightly. Then she closed the document and stood up. "I hope your head is clear now." Her voice was composed, professional, like she was speaking to a colleague, not the man she had given herself to just hours ago. Lucas felt something inside him crack. This wasn't what he wanted. He had never wanted to hurt her. "Ava, last night was a mistake," she interrupted, offering a polite, detached smile. "We got caught up in the moment. It happens." He flinched. The way she said it, so effortlessly, as if it hadn't meant anything, made him feel like the biggest fool in the world. "Is that what you really think?" he asked, his voice low. She tilted her head, studying him for a second, then exhaled. "What do you want me to say, Lucas? That I woke up this morning expecting you to be there? That I was stupid enough to think last night meant something more?" A bitter chuckle escaped her lips. "I won't make that mistake again." Lucas's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to fix this, wanted to tell her that it had meant everything, that it had changed him. But she was already walking past him, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. "Ava," he called, desperation lacing his tone, but she didn't stop. She simply disappeared down the hallway, leaving him standing there, feeling like the biggest idiot in the world. Lucas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He had ruined everything, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to fix it. The air in Ava's office was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing down on her as she sat behind her mahogany desk, staring at the divorce papers her grandfather had sent over. The pristine white pages felt heavier than they should, each word cutting deeper than the last. She had built her entire life around control, around ensuring that no one had power over her decisions, not the board members, not her competitors, and certainly not her grandfather. But now, here she was, once again trapped by the expectations of the man who had raised her. He had always wanted her to marry for advantage, for business, for appearances. And now that he believed her marriage to Lucas was nothing more than a contractual arrangement, he was determined to erase it like a mistake on a spreadsheet. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the edge of the papers, her mind a chaotic storm of emotions she didn't dare name. Did she want this? Did she want to erase everything she and Lucas had built, however fragile, however complicated? She wasn't sure anymore. But before she could dwell on the turmoil in her heart, the door to her office burst open with force, slamming against the wall. Lucas stood in the doorway, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his dark eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. He looked almost wild, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something raw, something desperate. His gaze locked onto the divorce papers on her desk, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them crackled like a live wire, charged with too many emotions to name. "Tell me you don't want this," Lucas demanded, his voice rough, edged with something dangerously close to heartbreak. He stepped further into the office, his presence overwhelming, filling every inch of space between them. "Tell me, this is your choice, not his." Ava swallowed hard, gripping the arms of her chair as if they could anchor her. She wanted to be strong, wanted to maintain the walls she had spent years building around herself. But when she looked into Lucas's eyes, she saw everything she had been trying to avoid: pain, frustration, and worst of all, hope. "I don't know what's real anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it was enough. Enough to make Lucas freeze, his expression darkening. "You don't know?" he repeated, his voice incredulous. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Ava, everything between us. It's real, or at least it is for me." He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of her desk. "You think I would fight this hard for something that didn't matter? That I would stand here, practically begging you not to sign those damn papers if I didn't feel something real?" Ava's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Her grip on the chair tightened as she forced herself to meet his gaze. "This was supposed to be just a deal, Lucas. That's what we agreed on." Her voice wavered, betraying the steadiness she was desperately trying to hold on to. Lucas let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah. Then tell me why I can't stand the thought of losing you." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body radiating tension. "Tell me why the idea of walking away from this, from you, feels like the biggest mistake of my life." Her breath hitched. He was breaking down every single one of her defenses, stripping her bare with nothing more than his words, his presence, his unwavering determination not to let her go. She had spent her entire life guarding her heart, refusing to let anyone in. But Lucas had slipped through the cracks, had embedded himself so deeply inside her that she wasn't sure how to exist without him anymore. Her vision blurred as unshed tears stung her eyes. Lucas. She wanted to push him away, to protect herself from the unbearable ache that was spreading through her chest. But she couldn't. Because the truth was, she didn't want to lose him either. Lucas seemed to sense her hesitation, the silent war raging inside her. He moved around the desk, coming to stand directly in front of her. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the single tear that had managed to escape. "Ava, look at me." She did. And what she saw stole her breath away. His eyes filled with emotion, with longing, with something so deep and consuming it left her completely undone. "I love you," he said, the words firm, unwavering. "And I'm not going anywhere." Her lips parted, a strangled sound escaping before she could stop it. Love. He loved her. The words settled into her chest, warm and terrifying all at once. Lucas let out a slow breath, his hands never leaving her face. "I don't care what your grandfather wants. I don't care about contracts or deals or anything else. What I care about is you." His voice dropped, becoming something softer, more intimate. "So tell me, Ava, do you want this divorce? Do you really want to end this?" She could have lied, could have saved herself from the vulnerability that was threatening to consume her. But when she opened her mouth, the truth came tumbling out instead. "No." The word was barely a whisper, but it was enough. Lucas's entire body tensed, as if he had been holding his breath, waiting for her answer. And then, before she could process what was happening, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. But she didn't care, because for the first time in a long time, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt safe. His lips brushed against her temple, then her cheek, then hovered just above hers. "Then don't let go," he murmured. Ava closed her eyes, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "I won't," she promised, and just like that, the divorce papers lay forgotten on the desk. The only thing that mattered now was the man holding her as if he would never let her go. The grand hall of Sterling Enterprises buzzed with anticipation. Every employee, from executives to interns, had gathered in the opulent atrium, their eyes glued to the stage where Lucas Hayes stood, his expression determined yet vulnerable. The whispers spread like wildfire. Why had the CEO's husband called for an emergency company-wide announcement? Ava Sterling, the woman who had built this empire with relentless hard work, stood at the back of the room, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs around her. She had no idea what Lucas was about to say, but something in his stance, in the way his fingers clenched the microphone, sent shivers down her spine. Lucas took a deep breath, scanning the sea of faces before him. He had never been the kind of man who craved attention, but today nothing mattered except the woman standing across the room. His wife, his love, his everything. He had made mistakes, allowing fear to push her away, letting doubts cloud what had become the most real thing in his life. But today, he would fix that. No more contracts, no more pretending, only the truth. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions raging inside him. "I know many of you have wondered about my place in this company, about why I, an ordinary IT employee, ended up married to Ava Sterling," he began, his voice carrying through the room, silencing the murmurs. "Some of you assumed it was a marriage of convenience, a strategic move, and to be honest, A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Ava inhaled sharply, her fingers curling into fists at her sides, but Lucas wasn't done. "I married Ava because of a deal, a contract, a necessity dictated by circumstances neither of us fully controlled," he continued, his gaze locking onto hers, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "But here's what none of you know. That deal, that contract, it became the most unexpected, beautiful thing in my life." Silence. Absolute deafening silence. Lucas took another step forward, his grip tightening on the microphone as his emotions swelled. "Ava Sterling is the most brilliant, hard-working and compassionate woman I've ever met. She built this company from the ground up, never once compromising her integrity. She's the kind of leader people respect, not because she demands it, but because she earns it every single day. And somehow, in the midst of all her responsibilities, she managed to teach me something I never thought I would learn." Ava's breath hitched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel every set of eyes flickering between them, but in that moment it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the man standing on that stage, bearing his soul for the entire world to see. "I didn't just fall in love with my wife," Lucas said, his voice raw with emotion. I fell for the woman behind the title. The woman who spends her weekends at orphanages, reading bedtime stories to children who have no one else. The woman who treats her employees like family, who never lets success turn her heart cold. I married Ava because of a deal, but I fell for her because of who she is. The moment those words left his lips, the room exploded into hushed gasps and murmurs. But Ava barely heard them, because in that moment her world had tilted on its axis. She'd spent months battling her own feelings, convincing herself that this love wasn't real, that it was built on shaky foundations. But here he was, shattering every last wall she had so desperately tried to hold on to. She didn't think, she couldn't. Before logic could catch up to her heart, her feet were already moving, faster, faster, through the sea of stunned employees, straight toward the man who had just bared his soul to her. Lucas barely had time to react before she crashed into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she pulled him down into a kiss that was nothing short of desperate, passionate, and filled with every unspoken word she'd been too afraid to say. The gasps around them grew louder, but neither of them cared. Lucas froze for only a second before melting into her, his arms tightening around her waist as he kissed her back just as fiercely. The world blurred. The company, the employees, the rules, they all faded into the background. The only thing that existed in that moment was them. When they finally pulled apart, Ava's hands trembled as she cupped his face, her eyes glassy with emotion. I love you too, she whispered, her voice breaking. I have for so long, but I was so afraid that it wasn't real, that I was just seeing what I wanted to see, but you just proved to me that it was never a lie. Lucas exhaled shakily, resting his forehead against hers. It was never a lie, he murmured, his thumb brushing against her cheek. Not for a second. A slow, hesitant clap broke the silence. Then another and another, and suddenly the entire room erupted into applause, cheers filling the air as their employees celebrated the love story that had unfolded before them. Some whistled, some wiped away tears, and some shook their heads in amused disbelief. Ava laughed through the tears spilling down her cheeks, burying her face in Lucas's chest as the reality of what had just happened settled in. She had spent her entire life fighting to stay strong, to never show vulnerability, but with Lucas she didn't have to fight anymore. She could just be. Lucas pulled her closer, pressing a lingering kiss to her temple before whispering in her ear, I meant every word, Ava. Every single one. She smiled against his chest, her heart finally at peace. I know, she whispered, and I'll never doubt it again. As they stood there wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the people who had witnessed their love story unfold, one thing became clear. This wasn't just the end of a contract, it was the beginning of their forever. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of blooming flowers as the city lights twinkled like fallen stars. Ava Sterling stood on the rooftop of the grand Sterling estate, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked at the man before her, the man who had changed everything. Lucas Hayes was no longer just the employee she had chosen for convenience, no longer just the husband she had married out of necessity. He was the man who had broken through her walls, the man who had turned a cold business deal into the warmest, most genuine love she had ever known. For months she had fought against the idea of love, telling herself that feelings had no place in a contract marriage. But every stolen glance, every lingering touch, every whispered confession had proved her wrong. And now, standing under the vast night sky, she realized that she had never been more sure of anything in her life. Lucas took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the velvet box in his pocket. Tonight was the night he would do what he should have done long ago. No contracts, no obligations, just love. Slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee, his eyes never leaving hers. Gasps filled the air behind them, as Ava's grandfather, family, and a few close friends watched the scene unfold. But in that moment, it was only the two of them. "Ava," Lucas began, his voice thick with emotion, "when we first got married, it wasn't for love, it wasn't for romance. It was a deal, a way for both of us to get what we needed. But somewhere along the way, something changed. You changed me." He let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. "I thought I was just a man trying to find his place in this world. But then you came into my life, and suddenly, nothing made sense without you." Ava's vision blurred with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched them to her chest. She had been proposed to before, once by a man who had only wanted her wealth, another time by someone who had seen her as nothing more than a business opportunity. But this was different. This was real. "I love you," Lucas continued, his voice unwavering. "Not as an employee, not as a man caught in an arranged marriage, but as someone who can't imagine his life without you. You are the strongest, most incredible woman I have ever met, and every single day I thank fate for bringing me into your world. But I don't want to just be a part of it. I want to be by your side forever. No deals, no contracts, just us." He finally pulled out the ring, its diamonds sparkling under the glow of the city lights. A symbol of everything they had built together, everything they had fought for. Ava's breath caught in her throat. For so long, she had believed that love was a weakness, something that could only bring pain. But Lucas had shown her that love wasn't about losing power. It was about finding someone who made you stronger, someone who would stand beside you no matter what. And in him, she had found exactly that. Slowly, she sank to her knees in front of him, her hands covering his, as she let out a shaky laugh. "You idiot!" she whispered, her voice breaking. "You didn't even have to ask." And then, before he could react, she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't the desperate, breathless kiss of two people caught in an arrangement. It was soft, deep, filled with promises that didn't need to be spoken. Lucas smiled against her lips, before pulling away just enough to slide the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just like they did. A cheer erupted from behind them, her grandfather, her friends, their employees all clapping, some wiping away tears. Even her grandfather, the man who had once tried to break them apart, now nodded in approval. "Finally," he muttered, shaking his head with a small smile. Ava laughed, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She turned back to Lucas, her fingers tracing his jaw as she whispered, "I never believed in love. But you made me believe." Lucas pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it was as if he never wanted to let go. "And I'll spend forever proving to you that it's the best thing we ever found." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the city lights shimmering around them, Ava knew one thing for certain: her forever had finally begun.